Let's maybe start by taking a look back. This is the fifth election in 4 years. How did we get here?
Right. So people think, wow, fifth election, things must not be working right. And to a certain extent, I think everybody can agree that things are not working properly. We had Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu serving 12 years consecutive term, 15 years in total, the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history. And unfortunately, he made so many political enemies during those 12 years, despite the successes in so many different areas, including opening up Israel's economy, turning Israel into a diplomatic and a regional military superpower. But when his government collapsed, as coalition governments do in a parliamentary system, he went to an election, and even though he came out on top in that first election cycle, he could not piece together a majority coalition. You have 120 members of the parliament. You need to cobble together a coalition of at least 61 in order to form a majority government and rule, which you need in order to pass legislation, in order to pass the consistent no confidence motions that come up before the government. But at the same time, those that oppose Netanyahu also could not form a majority coalition. And part of that reason is because you had the left wing that generally opposed Netanyahu. You also have some anti-Zionist parties in the Knesset that are Arab parties. And so those that didn't want to sit with Netanyahu could not put together a blocking coalition. And that has basically sent us into cycle after cycle of elections. After the third election, Netanyahu actually formed a unity government with his primary challenger, Benny Gantz. That government collapsed after about a year. And then in the fourth election, something changed. For the first time, the main challenger then, who was Yair Lapid, who is currently the interim prime minister, and we'll get to that in a minute, he was able to convince Naftali Bennett, a staunch member of the right-wing bloc, to defect from the right-wing bloc, and offering him the only position that he could possibly offer him in order to convince him to defect from the right-wing bloc. And that was the seat of Prime Minister itself.
The Prime Minister's chair.
And so even though Bennett only won 7 seats in the general election, about 5% of the vote, and one of those members didn't even want to join that coalition, he decided to take those 6 members into a government that would finally push Netanyahu out of office. Bennett became the prime minister.
I think it's unprecedented, actually, in Israeli history that a prime minister with so few seats took office.
It's not even close. I mean, you would never imagine. And in fact, Naftali Bennett had said during the fourth campaign that it would be undemocratic for somebody who had less than 10 seats, let alone 15 or 20, to actually become the prime minister. But he did. And it was a very unstable alliance that included members of the right wing who wanted to prevent Netanyahu from being prime minister, even though they're ideologically aligned, together with all the members of Israel's left wing, together with, for the first time, one of the non-Zionist Arab parties, the Ram party led by Mansour Abbas, and they formed the narrowest of narrow 61-member coalitions. And of course,
a very rocky coalition from the onset.
From the very beginning. And people could have predicted and did predict that the government would not last. The government lasted barely a year to the day. Naftali Bennett then resigned his post as prime minister. In fact, is not even running in these elections. He's taking a break from politics. But based on the relationship, the rotation arrangement that Bennett signed with Lapid, once Bennett resigned, Lapid actually became the interim prime minister. So for the first time in these 5 election cycles, the incumbent prime minister is not Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu was in the opposition for the last year. He did everything that he could to try to break that government. And now we are at a 5th election. And we have to see, and we will see shortly, if the results of the election will be different than the results of the first 4, and whether Benjamin Netanyahu can cobble together over 61 members. In each of the last 4 elections, he fell just below 1, 2, 3 seats below that threshold.
I think this election really is about Benjamin Netanyahu, whether he is going to make his comeback or not. Let's talk about this upcoming election. You know, how is it different from the last election?
Those 2 differences. First, as I mentioned before, the person sitting in the prime minister's chair is not Netanyahu. It's Yair Lapid. If we have another stalemate, which is a possibility, and we'll talk about that later, the person who remains prime minister until a government is formed is Yair Lapid. So that's definitely a major difference than all of the previous elections. another one of the big differences is that in the previous election cycles, you had piece by piece members of the right-wing camp who used to sit with Netanyahu defecting one by one by one. And in the fourth election cycle, the last cycle, you had Bennett's Yamina party, and also a party which was a breakaway from the Likud, which is the New Hope party, led by Gidon Sa'ar. And Sa'ar had challenged Netanyahu for the leadership in the Likud party in a primaries before the third election. And he also took several members from the Likud and eventually formed a government together with all the members of the left, including Prime Minister Yair Lapid. So one of the major differences here is that you don't have any parties that are sitting on the fence as to who they would support. You have very clear parties that say that they will absolutely support Netanyahu, and I think that they can be dependent on to support Netanyahu if he crosses that threshold. And then you have parties that are very clearly against Netanyahu, and not a single member of those parties would defect over to give Netanyahu that 61. So I think when the votes are counted, it will be very clear whether or not Netanyahu can form a government, and if not, if Lapid or anyone else could form a government.
Well, I do want to sort of get to that in a few minutes, the piecing of the puzzle, who can form a coalition, and we'll get to that in a minute. What I do want to talk about now are what are some of the major issues, essentially, that Israelis are going to the polls for in these elections. I mean, it can't just be all about whether it's bring Bibi back or not. I mean, what are some of the other issues that are taking center stage?
Well, if you look at the campaign ads in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, it's all about personality. Every party's ads, if it's a left-wing party, you see pictures with Netanyahu together with right-wing firebrand Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, making funny faces and basically asking the question, is this who you want to lead the country? All of the right-wing ads have pictures of Yair Lapid, Benny Gantz, and Mansour Abbas, the leader of the Ram party, sitting together making funny faces saying, is this the type of government that you want? So personalities are really at the front and center of at least what the parties are running on. But there are a lot of issues that really do come front and center. And I think the first is a identity issue about what kind of state does Israel want to be. And I think that by and large, the right-wing parties adhere to the principles of nationalism, a strong Jewish state in the Middle East with traditional Jewish and family values and strong security, versus a more left-wing view, which sees Israel as a secular extension of Europe on the Eastern Mediterranean. An Israel that gets along with Democrats, even if Democrats are not necessarily supporting Israel's greatest security interests. So I think that is primarily the choice that Israelis have to make. But within that, there are other choices. And some of the big issues that come up, obviously, is the Iranian nuclear issue.
Although that seems to have taken less of a center stage this election cycle as it has in past election cycles.
Correct. That's 100% right. And even though it's an existential issue to the state of Israel, it's not something that Israelis have been putting front and center. So there are the issues that are front and center, and then there are what is at stake. Mm-hmm. And what is at stake, I think, is very great. The Iranian issue is a big issue. Also, the Palestinian state issue. I mean, Yair Lapid went to the United Nations as the interim caretaker prime minister, stood up before the plenum and said in his speech that he felt that it was proper for Israel to get back onto a negotiations track for a two-state solution. He would certainly have support and did have support for those statements from the Biden administration. We saw during this last year's government that for the first time in over 9 years that ministers actually met in Ramallah with Mahmoud Abbas, the chairman of the Palestinian Authority, and the defense minister, Benny Gantz, actually invited Mahmoud Abbas to his home in Rosh Hashanah, and Netanyahu had not met with any members of the Palestinian Authority government for over 9 years. So I think that if Lapid and the left wing will form a government, there's a good chance that we might get back onto that two-state track. A big issue also here is economics.
I think economics is a very major issue this election cycle. The cost of living, the extreme high cost of living, that's really been dominating headlines recently. That, as well as the security situation, which unfortunately we've seen a wave of terror attacks in the past few weeks, past few months. So what can you tell us about those?
Absolutely. Well, cost of living you mentioned and the cost of housing, these are two areas that were very high going into the election cycle. Inflation now seems to be a global phenomenon, and because goods are not manufactured in Israel, they're manufactured abroad. If the cost of supplies go up, the cost of finished products in Israel are going way up. Israelis are feeling it in their pocket, and the first responsibility of the new incoming government, whoever it will be to set economic policy that can reduce the cost of living. Israel is an economic powerhouse in terms of GDP. Israelis earn more than in many other countries in Europe and around the world, but the cost of living in Israel is supremely high. So that's definitely something that Israelis feel. When you feel it in your pocket, you feel it. And the other is personal security. And the first role of any government is to protect its citizens. And you're correct. We've seen an influx of attacks, most notably in Judea and Samaria, but in other parts of the country as well, in Jerusalem and even in the center of Israel. And we've also seen an increase in violence in Arab sectors as well. So every Israeli has been affected, and it will really be up to the next government to set a strong security policy. And you do have parties on both the left and the right, like Benny Gantz on the left is running as strong security credentials, and then you also have parties on the right, like led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, running on a strong security policy as well.
So, let's talk for a moment back to the elections and the parties that we have. For the first time, I think these elections, we really are seeing sort of the extremes from both sides, both the right wing and the left wing, taking sort of a very central role or center stage in these elections. Itamar Ben-Gvir, for example, and of course the Arab parties, which Ram, as you mentioned, was included in the government for the first time. How did this happen? How did we get here?
I think it's actually a phenomenon that you're seeing in the United States and in Europe as well. There's tremendous polarization of politics. And that's happening here in Israel. But, I think that one of the legacies that Naftali Bennett actually left the Israeli people by, creating the government that he created and bowing out so quickly is that there were a lot of people that voted for Bennett, that voted for Gidon Sa'ar in this moderate right-wing camp that ultimately took all of those votes that would have preferred a strong right-wing government, and they brought it to the left and created a government which ultimately was unstable. And so now you don't have moderate right-wing parties because people on the right wing of the spectrum understand that if you want a right-wing government, you have to vote for an extreme right-wing party because they're the only party that will not defect and go to the left side of the spectrum. So, I think that two of the legacies that Naftali Bennett left the Israeli people, number one is Yair Lapid as the prime minister, and number two is that he's erased this moderate right sector of the electorate, which is strange because Israel really is a center right-wing country. So it's unfortunate that I think that Israel has sort of polarized itself, but it leaves a position for Likud to emerge as a strong center-right party. And on the left side as well, you have a combination now party between Benny Gantz's blue and white party in the last election, and he merged with the new right party. So you have a center-left, center-right party there as well. So while you do have the polarization, there still might be a place for members of the center of Israeli society.
Absolutely. Now, going back, we have, I think, just a little over 40 minutes until the polls close. Basically, this election really, there seems to be very, very high voter turnout. As of 7 p.m., there was 62.5% voter turnout. In the morning, we had sort of a record-breaking turnout that we haven't seen since 1999. So, Israelis really are scrambling to the polls this election. And I personally have gotten a lot of phone calls from I think all the Israelis are getting them that, hurry to the polls, sort of the Gewalt campaign that we're seeing at the last minute.
Well, voter turnout is one of the major issues of this election. On the one hand is the question of voter apathy, right? Mm-hmm. 5 elections, people are disenfranchised with the political system. So there is the risk that less Israelis feel like their vote matters because they keep casting their ballots and not getting a result or not getting the result that they want. So there's definitely the risk of lower voter turnout. But when you actually analyze this election and what will it take for one party or another to win this election, voter turnout is one of the biggest factors. And that is in several of the different camps. What we're seeing less of in this election is individuals that want to vote for one camp that might switch to the other. Rather, this election will be won or lost on voter turnout. Where do we see that? For example, if in the Arab sector you get less voter turnout, and the Arabs had 10 seats in the last election, if the Arabs will have in this election 7 or 8 seats, 8 seats I think would be the minimum that they could get the way they're aligned, or 4 if one of their parties doesn't get across the threshold, that would mean that there's 112 seats that are pro-Israel Zionist seats that then get divided up. And one of the blocks will have to get to 61 out of 112. If the Arabs will get 15 seats or 13 seats as they got in one of the election cycles, that's less votes that the other blocks have to piece together a government. At the same time, voter turnout on the left. If Yair Lapid takes away votes from smaller parties on the left wing, like the left flank, like Meretz or Labor, and one of those parties doesn't get across this minimum threshold, you need to get at least 3.25% of the total vote in order to enter the Knesset. It's basically a 4 seats or no seats bargain with the electoral threshold. If you don't get that, all the people that voted for that party, every single one of those votes gets discounted, and then the remaining votes get redistributed. So if you get almost 4 seats to the left, and you don't get across the threshold, 2 of those seats essentially go to the right, and that could swing the election. At the same time, for the Likud party, the largest party polling in this election, in one of the election cycles, what they did in the third election cycle, second cycle rather, they campaigned heavily in periphery areas where the tendency would be to vote for the Likud, but voter turnout was traditionally low. And what they did was they found an extra 200 to 300,000 votes, which gave them a few extra seats, and that changes the entire distribution. So ultimately, this entire election will be decided in terms of voter turnout in various blocks and also on the electoral threshold, because if any one of a few parties on either the right, the left, or the Arab side of the electorate don't pass the threshold, that can give the other side the extra 1 or 2 seats that they need to form a government.
All right, and so joining us now, Eliyahu Berkovitz, editor of Israel 365. Thanks for joining us. Eliyahu, I want to talk to you about the sort of, I don't know, some people are calling him the kingmaker of this election, Itamar Ben-Gvir. Mm-hmm. What can you tell us about him?
Well,
very sort of controversial figure.
I'm a feature articles writer. I'm not an expert like Alex is on that. I really appreciate your breakdown. I sat in front of him 3 weeks ago and spent some time speaking with him. Itamar Ben-Gvir has always been an outsider. He is the outsider, and he attracts outsiders, specifically from the right. And even when he grew up, he didn't do the army because he was too extreme. And the army said, no, thank you. So he attracts outsiders. And as a result, and the disenfranchised. And I think that what happened with Bennett is more people became disenfranchised because they said, we're right-wing, we voted for a right-wing guy, and here we are with a left-wing government that includes Mansour Abbas. So these disenfranchised outsiders and even semi-outsiders went with him. He's a follower of Kach, which people will call them extremists, but even there's a sliding scale. There are different levels of that. And he told me that the Itamar Ben-Gvir of 14 years old is not the Itamar Ben-Gvir that is today. So he's been in the public spotlight since he was 14. He was working for Kach when he was 14. So the question is not only who he was, but who he's going to be. He's developed and changed. The question is how much. He's unabashedly right-wing, will always remain right-wing. So even if we say this is who he was, that doesn't say who he is now, and I don't think it'll be saying who he will be. The question is how much is he willing to bend, to develop, to accommodate in order to get right-wing goals. That's my question about him now.
And what are the right-wing goals?
The ones that he said, first of all, one that I think that's deceptively important that people can't relate to unless they're in Israel. There's in the Temple Mount. Yair Lapid came out a couple weeks ago and said that he will not have any Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount, which is interesting because Jewish law, Israeli law mandates freedom of religion and equality of religion on the Temple Mount. So it's strange that he said that. Itamar Ben-Gvir has come out very strongly in favor. He says it's racist not to have Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount. Netanyahu has said he's not going to allow prayer on the Temple Mount. It's a very big issue right now, and people who want prayer on the Temple Mount, people who want a more Jewish nature to the state, they're really finding themselves with only one candidate, and I think that's giving him almost an artificial lift, an artificial boost.
Now, his critics have said that he is dangerous to democracy. What would you say about that?
Well, in a country that's had 5 elections in 4 years, we are the most democratic nation in the world right now. No, I don't think he's dangerous to democracy. And as I said, he's developed. He was quoted as saying he wants to kick all the Arabs out of the country. And when I asked him about that, he said he wants to kick all of the people who don't want Israel to exist out of the country. And that's a substantially different statement. People will say he's like anti-Arab. He's very strongly anti-terrorist and very pro-security. And right now we're going through a big wave of terror. The IDF is going out every single night. And I think security is a much bigger issue than people realize right now.
Religious Zionism has never secured as many votes as they're polling at right now. And according to many of the polls, they're 12, 13, 14 seats and are possibly in position to be the 3rd largest party. Why do you think it is all of a sudden that the Religious Zionists, led by Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, are soaring in the polls?
Well, I think there's 2 reasons for that. One is when I was living in Gush Etzion, we learned that you can be an ideologue, but if you pick your ideological party, then we end up all over the place and the left wing wins. So I think people are learning to say, okay, if we want right wing, we're not going to find our specific flavor of right wing, we'll go for the most right wing party. And I think also that the Israeli voters have gone right. The right wing is much more popular. The left wing, they built their base on land for peace and the Oslo, and no Israeli is buying that anymore. It's just so unpopular that people ran away from that. I think the Israeli voters have gone right.
And in terms of Ben-Gvir, we're also seeing not only voters coming in from Naftali Bennett's previous camp, but also we're seeing young Haredi voters, young ultra-Orthodox voters being drawn to Ben-Gvir.
That's a really interesting phenomenon. And again, I think it has to do with the Temple Mount. If you go up to the Temple Mount, first of all, you should know that the most Haredi and ultra-Orthodox rabbis and leaders say it's forbidden to go up to Temple Mount. But if you actually go up to the Temple Mount, most of the people who go up to the Temple Mount are Haredi and ultra-Orthodox. They're not listening to their leaders. It's the Temple Mount is becoming a very strong issue in the Haredi world, and they're voting that way.
I think one of the other issues with the Haredi populations is that you don't see much turnover in terms of the political leaders in these parties, and they're older, and you haven't really seen them get many more votes election after election, even though the population of Haredi in Israel grows at a tremendous rate, faster than other sectors of the society. And they're feeling that they're not actually taking care of the main needs of that sector of the society. So here's a firebrand. Here's someone that, even though he comes from outside the traditional Haredi camp, he is just as observant as they are and is bringing a new energy, and that energy is sweeping the nation. So I think that it's natural that young people that are looking for a political home, that feel disenfranchised with the previous options, are turning to Ben-Gvir as a legitimate option.
I think that's absolutely correct, and I think that we could sit here and dissect all the implications of that. The Haredi sector is changing, and their votes are changing, and they're changing socially.
Mm-hmm. And what about from the Likud? I mean, Ben Gvir sort of became this figure on the right. Is he also taking a lot of the votes from the Likud? And if so, I mean, how is all of this? I mean, all these votes, they're not coming from the left wing, they're coming from the right wing camp. How does this change the dynamics within the right wing bloc?
I think the problem is that people from outside, they don't realize that Netanyahu is not right wing. People on the right have realized a long time ago that Netanyahu he doesn't represent right wing interests. He's never going to annex Judea and Samaria. He will not allow prayer on the Temple Mount. He's an opportunist. He's not going to be right wing. So people in the center who become disillusioned with Netanyahu, and not only disillusioned, doubt whether or not he's going to be trustworthy to stay on the right wing, they will be moving towards Ben Gvir. And you have to remember, it's not just Ben Gvir. Ben Gvir is also Bezalel Smotrich. And even I had a very nice connection with Simcha Rotman. He's much more reasonable. There's no way you can describe him as an extremist, but he's religious Zionist. So there's a lot more to the religious Zionist party than just Itamar Ben Gvir.
Mm-hmm.
There's definitely a feeling. Obviously, Netanyahu has been the leader of the right-wing camp forever. I mean, for as long as he's been the prime minister, he's always ran from the right. Political circumstances have forced him to govern from the center, I think more often than he would prefer, but that is the nature of a very diverse society, and there are certain advantages to governing from the center. Certainly, members of the right wing don't think that Netanyahu is as hard right as he campaigns, and they might be right about that, but certainly he represents that center-right position. You're correct, Widar, that Ben Gvir and Smotrich have been polling votes in the recent polls away from the Likud. It's actually an opposite phenomenon as you've had on the left side of the spectrum. When the polling began, when the campaign started, you saw on the left Yair Lapid polling around 20 seats, and he continually grew in popularity at the expense of the smaller parties in his camp, which include Benny Gantz's National Unity Party, includes the once ruling Labor Party, which is now a small party on the fringe, and the far left Meretz Party. So Lapid has been taking votes away from those smaller parties in his camp, trying to become the ruling party. And what's happened on the right wing is the exact opposite, that Likud has been going down from initial polling place of about 34 seats down to where they currently are at 30 to 31 seats, depending on the poll. And I think that the reason why is because there's a feeling on the right wing of the spectrum, which is if you want Netanyahu to govern from the right, you have to strengthen the right flank. And ultimately for Netanyahu, it's not necessarily a question of whether he gets 27 seats or 30 seats or 35 seats. It's the question of whether he gets to 61. Now, there's been a lot of pressure from both within Israel and even from abroad in the United States, pressure on Netanyahu that if he should form a government, that he should not form it with Itamar Ben Gvir. And in fact, there's probably an electoral advantage if Ben Gvir will soar in the polls and become the third largest party, maybe 14 seats, maybe 15 seats. It'll be much easier for Netanyahu to justify forming a government with the third largest party that recommends him to be the prime minister if the religious Zionists would be much smaller. And Benny Gantz on the center to the left would eclipse religious Zionism in the polls, and they would be the larger party. Then there would probably be a lot more pressure on Netanyahu if he does cross that 61 threshold to turn to the left again and to govern from the center. So there's definitely a swing in the right wing saying the only way to make sure you get a right-wing government is to vote for as far right as you possibly can.
It's absolutely true. I saw that on the street. That's what my friends tell me. All the people I know, they said, the only way you can get Netanyahu to stay in line is to make it the only way he can get a government.
I think one of the more interesting phenomenons here, though, is the left-wing reaction to the rise of Ben Gvir in the polls. And they have been trying to delegitimize Prime Minister Netanyahu for the last 3 years already, saying you can't have a prime minister that is indicted, that is under trial for corruption, saying that he's an illegitimate prime minister. And now they're trying to make it even more illegitimate if Netanyahu will form a government together with Ben Gvir and potentially make Ben Gvir a high-ranking minister, which he would earn if they would get 14 seats or more. And you've actually seen pressure, from the United States also, Senator Bob Menendez from New Jersey. You had Representative Brad Sherman from Illinois, both saying that Netanyahu should not form a government. It would be very hard to defend Israeli positions if Netanyahu formed a government with Ben Gvir. But, ultimately, we saw President Herzog in the United States this week and asked both the U.S. administration and also the American Jewish community to honor the results of the Israeli election. So we'll see what happens. But the push to delegitimize the government is actually very, very dangerous. Israel's been facing delegitimization campaigns for the last several years. They're intensifying. They're on the college campuses. They're even in the corporate world. They're invading the discourse on social media, mainstream media. And when you have left-wing politicians going out there saying that the Israeli government is becoming more right-wing, potentially racist, illegitimate, you're actually fueling the delegitimization campaigns that the Palestinian Authority has been leading from Ramallah that's penetrated the international community for years. And I don't think that they understand the type of damage that they could do. You have to understand Ben Gvir is, at best, one Knesset member out of 120. And he represents a view that clearly many Israelis agree with. So, trying to call the Israeli government illegitimate on those grounds can have a very bad boomerang effect that might be hard to put that cat back in the bag, regardless of who forms the next government.
I think that's an interesting point. I think part of the thing is that because Biden is in the White House and he's not seen as a big friend of Israel, people say we need a strong right-wing government. If it was a pro-Israel government like Trump, we wouldn't need someone so stridently pro-Israel.
Eliyahu, last question. Predictions for tonight. Do you think Itamar Ben-Gvir, will he reach those 15 mandates? What do you think?
I actually do. I actually do think he's going to make it. He's certainly having an effect.
All right, well, we'll find out very shortly. We have about 25 minutes left till the exit polls come in. And right now, we're going to take a look at Israelis going to the polls today. Take a look.
2019, Israelis heading back to the ballot boxes to cast their vote for Knesset. And once again, citizens are praying for an end to the seemingly endless cycle of government instability and expensive campaign seasons.
Unfortunately, it's the fifth election that we have in the last year and a half or 2 years. And unfortunately, again, it's going to be exactly the same results, 60-60, maybe 61-59 to one of the blocks, but that's not going to be a stable government. So sadly, we're probably going to go into another one in a few months, 6 months to 9 months, and that's the situation now in Israel.
But voter apathy and exhaustion aside, many are still hopeful that this latest election will be the last in the series. The only problem in breaking the stalemate, however, in many voters' eyes, is that party platforms are still falling by the wayside. While the economy, extortionately high cost of living, and national security risks topping people's day-to-day priorities, the vote is still seemingly down to those who are either for or against Benjamin Netanyahu. Those opposed to King Bibi, as he's commonly called, painting Netanyahu as a serial liar, a corrupt criminal, and a populist Machiavellian narcissist.
I'm really worried about what will happen after the elections, and I reckon that there will be a right-wing government by Ben Gvir and Bibi, and I think it will be really, really bad for the country. And I'm really, really afraid.
I see the result, what happens all those years that he was prime minister, we don't see nothing. So that's my opinion about it, why I want guns. I want renew, I want something else, not only Bibi, 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 Bibi.
Netanyahu and his base, in contrast, portraying the longest-serving prime minister and now opposition leader at the helm of the Likud party as the only person capable of guiding the country back on track and through its many steep challenges.
I'm going to vote in Bibi Netanyahu. I hope that he make the government, but I hope that he make a not very strong government with the religion. I hope it's going to be more liberal government.
אני כל החיים, כל המשפחה, הצבענו ליכוד ונשאר ליכוד. אנחנו שמחים שיש עוד מערכת בחירות ושיהיה צ'אנס גדול לביבי נתניהו. אנחנו בוחרים אך ורק בביבי נתניהו.
Hi everyone, it's it's Emmanuel Kadosh. I wanted to invite you all to subscribe to ILTV Plus, where you can find our daily news and updates about Israel. And not only that, but live feeds, entertainment, our kosher food show, and so.
Okay, and we're back. Alex, so far it's an interesting evening. I want to talk a little bit about interim Prime Minister Yair Lapid. How has he fared so far as the Prime Minister?
Well, Yair Lapid had a few months. He actually played the last government perfectly. It was an unstable alliance to begin with. He allowed Naftali Bennett to go first in that alignment, let Naftali Bennett deal with the coronavirus crisis that he didn't want to deal with. And ultimately, when the government fell apart, the way that rotation arrangement worked is that if the right wing was responsible for the crash of the government, that Lapid automatically became the prime minister in the caretaker scenario between the crash of the government and the new election, including up until a new government gets formed. So first of all, political brilliance by Yair Lapid to even be in the seat of prime minister today, even though he only won 17 seats in the last election. And he's had now just a few months as prime minister, and he has taken advantage of every second. First, people will remember that they launched a military campaign for 3 days into Gaza. It was a highly targeted campaign. They took out many of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad operatives, many strategic targets, limited civilian casualties in Gaza. There were no Israeli casualties whatsoever. They stopped the operation after 3 days before the international community could start getting up in arms over continued Israeli violence in the Gaza Strip. So that was definitely a check mark for Lapid as prime minister. On the domestic front, there was a teacher strike that was lingering since the last school year, which they averted at the last second. Lapid has taken every opportunity to meet as many world leaders as possible. Joe Biden, President of the United States, came to Israel in July. He met with him. It was a rather successful tour. There were no diplomatic incidents, which was the most important priority of that visit. And Lapid has also gone to France. His first trip was to meet Emmanuel Macron. He's met with Chancellor Scholz of Germany. And then he also went to representing Israel at the United Nations, where he met with several other international leaders, including the Prime Minister of Greece, including the President of Turkey, Recep Erdogan. And he got up and he spoke before the plenum. Some people were upset about the statements of the two-state solution, but others responded very positively. And we know that Yair Lapid, he comes from a television background. You know, he's not shy to talk in front of the camera. You know, he looks good in a suit. He's very well spoken, and so many Israelis felt like he did a fairly decent job there as well. I think one of the more controversial acts that he took as a caretaker and interim prime minister was to sign a SNAP maritime border agreement with Lebanon, brokered by the United States. And you know, this is an issue which was on the negotiating table for 10 years. As most people know, Israel has discovered tremendous reservoirs of natural gas off the Mediterranean coast. We already have 3 natural gas rigs that are online, the Tamar rig and the Leviathan and the Karish rig, which just came on this week. And there are other rigs that go beyond the Israeli economic waters into Lebanon, including the Kana rig. There's also apparently a reservoir off the coast of Gaza. And what Yair Lapid did was basically switch the entire terms of the negotiation that had been, as I mentioned, going on for 10 years, giving Lebanon essentially 100% of their initial claim, giving them full control of the Kana reservoir, which actually still encroaches into Israeli territory even after the deal. But Lapid said that he did that in order to avert a war with Hezbollah. And Netanyahu has said that that was a complete capitulation to Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, capitulation to Iran, which controls Hezbollah, in exchange for some guarantees of revenue that are being promised by the United States, the details of which have not yet been fully negotiated. There was arguments that a caretaker government should not be permitted to close such a sensitive agreement in this interim period, but Lapid did it anyway. And
it's true. I mean, you know, many critics have said of Lapid's term as interim prime minister that he has taken a lot of liberties that an interim prime minister usually doesn't take as a caretaker government, and yet he's gone ahead and done that. Has it worked for him, do you think?
Absolutely. He had a limited amount of time to prove to the Israeli public that he could handle the job of being prime minister. As I mentioned, he comes from the world of television. He didn't serve in a combat unit in the IDF. He doesn't have tremendous security experience. He was the finance minister in an earlier Netanyahu government. Eventually, he was fired as the finance minister. So he really needed to prove to the Israeli populace that he could be the prime minister, and he's been campaigning from the prime minister's chair, which for him is a significant advantage.
A huge advantage. And now let's talk about Netanyahu, head of the opposition for the first time in a very long time. How has he fared as head of the opposition?
Well, it's not the first time that he's sat as the head of the opposition.
No, but it has been for
Correct.
quite a while.
He was 12 years consecutive in the prime minister's chair, and certainly it was difficult for him to make that transition. Very odd behavior for the opposition. The Likud party and the entire opposition united as a bloc. In the opposition, they boycotted many of the votes. They boycotted many of the committees. You might have thought that the opposition would have set up a shadow government to criticize every last move and to set alternative policies. They didn't really do that. But Netanyahu did hammer away at the members of the government, particularly those on the right, particularly those members of Naftali Bennett's Yamina party, one by one, to get them to defect from Bennett's government. First, getting Amichai Shikli not to join the government to begin with, then getting Idit Silman to stop voting with the government, and then ultimately, when it became clear that other members of Bennett's party would not vote for the government, he ultimately did collapse that alliance, the Shaky alliance, and got Israel into yet another election cycle, which was really the one thing that Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid had promised, that they would avoid a fifth election. And yet, just 1 year later, here we are.
Here we are. And, many have said that this latest coalition, this last coalition, has been sort of a failure in a sense, in terms sort of a social experiment that has failed. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's very difficult in this age of polarizing politics to govern when you don't have an ideological bloc, and you did not have one. You had at the beginning of the term, Bennett and Lapid both said that obviously 30% of all the issues we don't agree on, but 70% of the issues we do agree on. So we're going to agree just to govern based on those 70%. But ultimately, the controversial issues are all in the margins, and they could not get support. I mean, you had the Ram Party, for example, threatening to leave the government during just prior to the operation in May, which happened just right around the crashing of the government. So it wasn't even clear that you had a 61-seat majority, not just to pass simple legislation, but to back major security operations. So ultimately, I think it was very much a failed experiment which was taken specifically and solely for the purpose of removing Netanyahu from office. So if that was the only goal, they certainly succeeded. In terms of creating stability for the Israeli population that just been through 4 elections, no, it was a complete failure.
All right, and now we have our next guest joining us, Adam Scott Bellos. He is the host of Janus's Wine with Adam and CEO of the Israel Innovation Fund and Wine on the Vine. Adam, tell me, is
Adam,
that coffee in there?
There is not coffee
Adam,
in
tell
my
us
cup.
what we're drinking tonight.
We are drinking the Gush Etzion Red Blend. It is a fine Judean wine. Thank you for having me, guys. I'm so happy to be with both of you because I love both of you so much.
Well, we're happy to have you.
Crazy night tonight, huh? Like,
Absolutely.
You could feel it in the air how special today is. It's like everybody knows something big is going to happen.
Well, we're going to find out very shortly. In the meantime, let's kind of talk about the different possibilities that this night could lead to. Will Netanyahu have enough to form a right-wing government and make his comeback?
You're asking me what I think.
And, what type of government could he form?
So, apparently, as of right now, Shas has just shut down their post-election party. And there's a rumor going around that the Likud might be shutting their post-election party down too, which could necessarily not be so good for Likud, or it could mean that something serious is going on, and they might be already starting to negotiate with people behind the scenes because there's work to be done. But at the end of the day, the last 5 elections have been about 2 things. It's been a cultural referendum on like what the culture of the country and the political culture of the country should be, and who the leader of the country should be. So, I mean, it's been a Bibi conversation since the beginning of this election cycle. It's also been a cultural conversation that's, what type of government is it going to be? Is it going to be left? Is it going to be right? Is it going to be religious? Will it be secular? But to answer your question, there's only 2 possibilities. Either Benny Gantz or Bibi Netanyahu is going to be prime minister. And I think based on the voter turnout being so high, I think we're looking at a Netanyahu government. Who's going to be in that government? It's going to depend on, in my opinion, how many seats Ben Gvir gets and how many seats the Arab parties are able to pull together. So I think if they cross the threshold and even make it to 5, I think we could be looking at a very different government than if they only get 4. It's anybody's game, but at the end of the day, Netanyahu has been biding his time, allowing, like Alex was saying, for this government that didn't really have an ideological focus to fall. And I mean, like, this was political strategy at its best with Bennett and how they were able to outmaneuver Netanyahu. But at the same time, I think that the fox of Israeli politics knows what he's doing. And if anybody can get what they want, it's Bibi Netanyahu.
But you mentioned...
Benny Gantz and Netanyahu, you've counted out Yair Lapid.
I don't think people want Lapid as the leader of the country. I think he represents something that a lot of people believe in. I think that there are many people that... I was originally involved with the Yesh Atid party when it started in 2013, but it's not the party that it once was. And I think that a lot of people are rather annoyed with Lapid's ability to make everything about himself. And if he doesn't make it about himself, he makes it about Bibi in a negative way. And like Lapid's go-to attitude is to go super positive or super negative. And there's no kind of in-between with him, at least in my opinion of the reading of him.
So Adam, I know quite a few people who would actually disagree with you on that statement, who, are very ardent Lapid followers, who actually believe that Lapid could be the next prime minister. Alex, what do you think?
Wait,
do you
I
agree
just want to say,
Adam?
I also agree that, that there are rainbows in the sky and, man drops from the heavens, but just because I want something doesn't mean it's going to happen.
So Alex, do you agree with Adam's assessment?
Well, Benny Gantz, the current defense minister, who was in the previous election cycles the primary challenger to Netanyahu. In fact, he was aligned together with Yair Lapid in the large blue and white alignment that challenged Netanyahu in the second and the third election cycles. And he's trying to position himself as the potential candidate for prime minister. And what we saw in the fourth government, essentially, was that Lapid, who came in with the second highest seat total, 13 seats behind the Likud, only 17 seats, it wasn't enough to form a government. And he had to cajole one of the members of the right-wing camp over to his camp to form an anti-Netanyahu blocking coalition. And so what you had for the first time was Naftali Bennett, a leader of a small party, emerging as prime minister. And what Benny Gantz has been campaigning on is it's not who's the largest party, but it's who's the most responsible party, and it's who's the party that can unite different factions. And I think that, Adam, what you're speaking about is that there is a limited number of parties that would be willing to sit with Lapid. Lapid is
that's
staunchly secularist. Is much more progressive than Benny Gantz. Gantz positions himself in the center, and he's sitting with some members of his own party now, which is in alignment with the New Hope Party, which are former members of the Likud. So it is a sort of center-left to center-right alliance. And Gantz also was a former chief of staff of the IDF and also served in this last government and even in Netanyahu's last government as a defense minister. So if you're going to put security first, you definitely can look to Gantz as having an advantage over Lapid. But more importantly, if Netanyahu doesn't get to 61. Now becomes the political circus.
Yes.
What type of government can be formed? And most Israelis don't want to see a government formed with all of the Arab parties, because the Arab parties are self-proclaimed anti-Zionist parties, and they make it very, very difficult for Israel to advance its own security interests, its own national interests, because they're opposed to those interests. So the question is then, how can you form an alternative that goes with both the right and the left? And what Benny Gantz is hoping is that the religious parties, who desperately want to be part of the government because they need budgetary allotments in order to fund their houses of worship and many of their other concerns, that Gantz might be a more palatable candidate to sit with those previous members of the Netanyahu bloc and some of the less extreme members of the far left-wing bloc, and form some kind of government that's in the middle.
Well, that raises a lot of questions, because first of all, will the ultra-Orthodox agree to sit in a government, even if it's led by Benny Gantz, along with Yair Lapid? That's one question. The second question is, we've seen Bennett, we've seen Lapid, and we've seen Gantz sit in this past government with Ram, the Arab Party. Will they sit in another government with the Arab parties if it means the difference between leading the next government or being in the opposition?
So I'll answer the first question first. The Haredi parties will definitely sit with Gantz, and that's going to be a huge blustering to what he's doing right now and his ability to negotiate, because they've been somewhat of a linchpin in making governments. In terms of sitting with the Arab parties, I mean, listen, if you've done it once, you'll do it a second time.
But the Haredi did not sit with him previously.
Correct, but at the same time, Gantz is not a staunch secularist. He's a cultural Jew. I mean, I remember there was this beautiful photo of him shaking the lulav with tefillin on and his talit on, and that speaks to religious voters that he's connected to Jewish tradition and religious observance, so to speak. And I think that the biggest thing that's very important to remember about Gantz is two things. One, everybody has constantly written him off and says he's not going to get to the place that he ends up getting to constantly. I mean, we've seen this in the last 4 elections. Everybody thought he was a done deal, I believe, after the second election when he had the government with Netanyahu. If that was the first or the second election, I lose track. We've had so many. And he ended up coming out way on top. The other thing that I would say is that I don't think that you can rule out the fact that everybody could technically sit with him, unlike Netanyahu, and that's where the question of the night is going to be. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens. I think that everybody should have a very open mind on the possibilities of what could happen. Personally, I think that Netanyahu will pull this together just because this is what he wants. But and he's been good at politically maneuvering since the 80s. I mean, the guy is the fox of Israeli politics, so to speak. I mean, he's been the leader. He's driven the country's agenda forward for the last 12 years. It has nothing to do with whether or not I like him as a person, but I mean, realistically, he's got the biggest shot. But I just can't logically rule out Gantz as a major possibility of being able to bring the country and the parties together. Are you guys following? Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that's right. And ultimately, it is the parliament that selects the prime minister. And
right, so let's talk a little bit
That's
about
a very good point.
how the voting works here in Israel, because it is a very complicated process.
It's very different from the United States.
So Alex, why don't you give us a rundown?
So Israelis who went to the polls today would go and find a box with about 35 different slips of paper.
I think 39, right? There's 39 parties.
Do you know there was
running
a
in this
pirate
election.
party? This time there was a pirate party.
And so what you do is when you get to the voting booth, you go behind in the box and you pick the slip of paper that has the call letters of the party you want to vote for. You take that slip of paper, you put it into an envelope, you seal that envelope, you put it in the box. By the way, before you're able to do that, you have to present your identification. You can only vote in one specific voting booth that has your name pre-listed there, which really does eliminate the types of voter fraud that was being accused in other countries. And once you put that in the box, the polls are open until 10 p.m., which is in just a few more minutes, and we're going to start to get the results. Then from 10 p.m. starts an incredible operation to count every single one of these paper ballots. We'll get the exit polls soon, which are basically the television stations sitting outside the voting booths asking people who they voted for. It won't be the final results. It will be...
That can sometimes take a few days.
It will take probably up to 48 hours to
Yep.
actually figure out how many votes go to each party. And as the votes are counted, because you have 120 seats out of 100% of votes, there are distributions. And so a few votes one way or another can change the entire distribution. And in an election that will probably be decided by 1 or 2 seats, those small distributions, if one party gains at the expense of another that's in the opposing camp, that can change the entire results of the election. So as we get set to see the exit polls, we might not know the actual results of the election. And in 2 of the different election cycles in these last 5, it looked clear that Netanyahu was going to form a government. And then as the actual votes got counted over the next 48 hours, slowly, slight shifts in the final count changed the actual results.
And we should mention that you have to have 3.25% of the vote in order to pass the electoral threshold. We'll see in just a minute. The exit polls are coming in just a minute. Adam, I want to hear final thoughts from you on tonight.
I think it's anybody's game. I really think it can be up in the air. I still think very much that Bibi will do whatever he has to do to regain his power, given that he wants to make peace with Saudi Arabia, and he feels that he's the only person that could do it. At the same time, you cannot rule out the fact that Benny Gantz may be the person that will actually be able to bring the country together in terms of all of the different political parties. So I think that, we'll know more as the exit polls come out, but I will say this final thought. I mean, I know this isn't going to be my final thought of the night, but final thought for this segment. Pre 10 p.m. polls closing, I think we'll have a government by the end of November. And I think that the Israeli people are tired of this. And I think the politicians are tired of this. And I think that given that there was such a large voter turnout, they're saying this is the largest voter turnout since 1999. I think that means the country is done with these elections and that we want a finalized government.
I don't know if it's possible to take a look at what the polls were showing just prior to the election day. If we can take a look at what the pre-election polls tab in our little sheet that we had made before. These are not. Are these the results that we're looking at right now, or are these the pre-results?
Exit polls.
I think that's the pre-election results. Not sure if that's been filled in.
That is pre. Those are the numbers I was looking at before I came on.
If you can switch to the other tab, which is the pre-election polls, we can see what, and we'll get those results up for you shortly, right? So there you see that the Likud party, if we can scroll a little bit to the left so you can see the names of the parties, the Likud party led by Netanyahu was polling at 31 seats, having 29 in the previous government. The Yesh Atid party had 17 seats in the previous government, polling at 25. And then Religious Zionism coming in third place with 14 seats. I'm not sure why we're not seeing that exactly right.
No, Gantz, it says, I think this is, I don't know if all that data is correct.
We've shifted off of that graphic.
All right, well, Adam, like you said, it's anybody's night. Thank you for joining us, and we will be back soon with the exit polls.
Thank you for having me.
Great.
Alex, so, former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu both go to the polls today, knowing that their political fates could be decided. Prime Minister Yair Lapid and his wife cast their ballots in Tel Aviv. Only in office as a caretaker for several months, he knows that his path to remain in power is tenuous indeed. It's a long shot to hope that his Yesh Atid party can finish ahead of Likud, and even less likely that he can cobble together a coalition majority, even if he does.
הבחירות האלה הן בין העתיד לבין העבר. אז תלכו היום להצביע בשביל העתיד של הילדים שלנו, בשביל העתיד של המדינה שלנו. תצביעו טוב, שיהיה בהצלחה לכולם. תודה רבה.
Benjamin Netanyahu and his wife Sarah voted in Jerusalem. It has been a rocky few years for the longtime prime minister. He's been in opposition after 12 consecutive years in office, compounded by criminal charges. Yet, according to most recent polls, Bibi, as he is popularly known, is within one seat of a coalition that would return him to office. אז זו זכות גדולה ללכת ולהצביע. אני אומר את זה כמובן לתומכים שלנו, אבל בכלל לאזרחי ישראל. אני אמרתי לכם שאני קצת אבל בעזרת השם, אנשים ששומעים אותנו, אני מקווה שנסיים את היום בחיוך, אבל זה תלוי באנשים.
Extreme right-wing lawmaker Itamar Ben-Gvir cast his ballot in Kiryat Arba. Ben-Gvir is number 2 on the religious Zionism slate, which polls show finishing as high as 3rd. Ben-Gvir's demand that he become Minister of Internal Security if Netanyahu forms the next government was greeted with alarm by many.
בפתק אחד, נתניהו בעזרת השם יהיה ראש ממשלה, אבל תקום כאן ממשלת ימין מלא מלא בלי גנץ, ונוכל לדאוג לחיילים, לשוטרים, לאזרחים, למצב במדינת ישראל. בפתק אחד גם נתניהו ראש ממשלה וגם ממשלת ימין.
Defense Minister Benny Gantz voted in his hometown of Rosh Hashanah. Viewing a potential deadlock between Netanyahu and Lapid, Gantz hopes to emerge as head of a unity government.
בעיניי, הבחירות האלה הן לא על המפלגה הגדולה, אלא על המפלגה שיכולה. הן נגד ההסתה, הן נגד הפילוג, הן נגד ההשמצה, הן בעד האחדות. ושם אנחנו נחתור לזה. לכן אני קורא לכולם ללכת להצביע, ושניפגש בשמחות ופחות בבחירות.
Polls remain open until 10 in the evening. At that time, the leading TV stations will release exit polls, which will give the first indication of the results.
Hi everyone, it's Emmanuel Kadosh. I wanted to invite you all to subscribe to ILTV Plus, where you can find our daily news and updates about Israel. And not only that, but live feeds, entertainment, our kosher food show, and so much more.
Okay, Alex, so this is it. The polls have closed. The initial exit polls starting to come in. And what we're seeing is that Netanyahu is on track to win, to form the next government. He's made his comeback, so to speak.
Well, we have to see because it looks according to most of the exit polls, and we'll get the numbers up for you shortly, that Netanyahu is on track for a government of 61 to 62 seats, which is the narrowest of narrow majorities. Obviously, if he has 61, that's all he needs to form a government, and it really probably won't matter too much if it's 61 or 62 or 63. But if the exit polls are showing just 61 or just 62, we know from experience over the last several years of election cycles that as the voting as the votes are actually counted one by one, that a seat for one party can move to another party, and a seat from a second party can move to a fourth party. And so 61 could easily turn into 60, which is not enough to form a majority, and could also turn into 59. But it looks like, according to all the polls, that Netanyahu will win 30 to 31 seats. One of the
and I should mention that Yesh Atid also polling between 22 to 24 seats, and the big surprise of this year's elections, or maybe not a surprise, is the National Religious Party that looks like it's polling anywhere between 12 and 15 seats. So that is going to be interesting to see just how many seats they get. But it does look like they have passed the National Unity Party to become the third largest party in Israel, which is quite an accomplishment and quite a surprise.
I think one of the other surprises here that we're looking at is that the religious party Shas, which represents the Sephardi Jewry, seems to have soared in many of the polls up to 10 seats. And the other religious party representing Ashkenazi Judaism, the United Torah Judaism, has in most polls received 7 or 8, which would give the religious bloc 17 to 18 seats.
And here we see, on our screen that we have the Likud coming in with 30 seats, Yesh Atid with 24. So it does look like Netanyahu is on track to form the next coalition. But as Alex, you said, anything can happen. And we will not know the final results of the elections for at least another day or two as the votes are being counted. And here now we see the Religious Zionist Party coming in at 14 seats, National Unity with 11, Shas with 10, and United Torah Judaism with 7. And now let's talk a little bit about the smaller parties, who has passed the threshold and who has not. Labor Party polling at 6, Meretz with 5, Israel Beiteinu with 4, United Arab List Ram with 4 seats, and Hadash and Tal looks like they also have passed the threshold with 4 seats. Let's talk about who hasn't seemingly passed the threshold. Ayelet Shaked's party.
Right. So Ayelet Shaked was the number 2 behind Naftali Bennett in the Yamina party. And many of the Yamina voters felt that they got swindled in the last election, that many of them supported a right-wing government only to watch Naftali Bennett ultimately in power. The entire left wing, who were sitting for many years on the backbenches of the opposition, bringing them into the halls of power, into very powerful ministries, and forming a government together with an Arab anti-Zionist party. And Shaked took over the party when Naftali Bennett essentially resigned his post as prime minister and essentially resigned from politics moving forward for the time being. And she insisted that she would still run, despite the fact that not one of the polls over the last several months showed her getting across the threshold. And in an election cycle that could be determined by just 1 or 2 votes, any votes that she would take would potentially imperil Netanyahu's ability to form a right-wing government. And people actually have to vote based on the threshold, right? There's a major argument. Don't cast a vote for a party that might not cross the threshold because your vote ultimately will be
vote goes
discarded.
To waste.
And so it's the fear over whether a party would cross the threshold that actually prevents people from voting from that party, even if ideologically they would agree with those positions. It's as much about ideology as about making your vote count. So Shaked did not pass the threshold, and there was a risk that would cost Netanyahu his majority. It does look, according to the early exit poll results, that Netanyahu will be able to form a very slim but majority coalition and return to the seat of power.
And it does look like he has made his comeback, that Netanyahu will most likely be the next prime minister. But again, we have to wait till the final results come in, although it really is looking like it is Netanyahu's night. Some even saying, that he has 62 seats. So that's going to be very interesting. I mean, now let's take a look at the numbers that we've seen on the screen right now, how a Netanyahu-led government would look like. So we have Netanyahu together with the Likud, together with the National Religious Zionist Party, with Shas, with United Torah Judaism, and that's enough.
That would be his government.
That would be enough to form a government, a very right-wing government, a government that includes the ultra-Orthodox parties, and that would send Yair Lapid, Benny Gantz, all to the opposition. Now, I have heard also, in speaking and interviewing a lot of experts in the past few weeks, that there's a second scenario, that Netanyahu will actually turn to Lapid and Gantz and Lieberman and say to them, join a government with me. Let's make a sort of another national unity government. We'll leave both extremes on the side. After tonight's results, how likely is that to happen?
Well, the only way such a scenario would be possible would be if Netanyahu crosses that threshold of the 61, 62 together with his natural right-wing allies. If he had not crossed that threshold, there would be nobody that you just mentioned, not Lapid, not Gantz, not Lieberman, that would agree to sit in such an alignment and empower Netanyahu to be the prime minister. Yet, what will happen over the next couple of days is that each one of the party heads will go to the president of Israel and will recommend who they want to be the prime minister. It looks as though Netanyahu will have the recommendations of at least 61 Knesset members. Mm-hmm. And that is when the coalition negotiations will begin. And there is definitely an argument, and as I mentioned earlier in the program, there's a lot of pressure on Netanyahu, both from the center and left side of the Israeli spectrum, as well as from countries outside of Israel, pushing Netanyahu not to form a narrow right-wing government, but to form a centrist alliance. And as you mentioned, in that kind of scenario, Netanyahu can say, look, guys, you cannot prevent me from being the prime minister. I can tomorrow sign a coalition agreement together with the religious Zionists, together with Shas, together with United Torah Judaism, and I can make a narrow right-wing government. Or we can form a broad unity government together potentially with Gantz, but together potentially with Yair Lapid, and they would be in a rather weak negotiating position, and they would be able to potentially go back to their constituents and say that they were able to block Netanyahu from forming a narrow government and keeping Israel on a more centrist course. But I think that is actually, at this point in time, a very unlikely scenario, especially given the results whereby religious Zionists coming in as the third largest party with 14 or 15 seats. And the reason why it's unlikely scenario is because in the third election cycle, you had Netanyahu forming a unity government together with Gantz, and ultimately it was an unstable alliance. You saw Naftali Bennett and Gidon Sa'ar from the right forming a government after the fourth election with Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz, ultimately an unstable alignment. So I think Netanyahu would be thinking that would he want to bring his own opposition into the coalition? The major incentive of someone like Lapid or Gantz to join a Netanyahu government would be for the purposes of being able to crash that government at the opportune moment and get to yet another election. So for Netanyahu, the most stable alliance is actually the narrow right-wing alliance, because the religious Zionists and the religious parties have no reason to bolt the Netanyahu government. They'll get what they want in negotiations, and they will give Netanyahu the stability to govern from the position where he's the most comfortable, which is on the right.
So as you mentioned, this is where it gets really interesting. Each party will go to the president of Israel, will make their recommendation for a prime minister. Then the negotiations begin once the president, of course, gives the mandate to the leader most likely to be able to form a coalition. Now, the negotiations, the religious Zionist party with a really strong position, what are they going to be asking?
That's a great question, and there's been rumors that Bezalel Smotrich, who's the head of this technical bloc of three religious Zionist parties, might demand to be the defense minister in such an alignment. And what's been even more controversial has been the demand that Itamar Ben-Gvir made just yesterday, saying that if they get into the government, that he's going to demand to be the internal security minister, which will be the minister in charge of the police. And what he wants to do is to change the rules of engagement for police officers in the army, that they should be able to be more easily permitted to shoot in situations in which they feel threatened by a potential terrorist, to be able to give police and army immunity, so that if one of them does pull the trigger in a dangerous situation, even if they might have been in the wrong, that they wouldn't be imprisoned, in order to not make them fear taking the right action, putting the lives of the Israeli security before the lives of the terrorists that they're trying to protect Israelis from. So you could see Smotrich again pushing for defense. You could see Ben-Gvir pushing for internal security. And I think there'll be a lot of pressure on Netanyahu at this point to try to minimize the roles that the religious Zionists get in the negotiations. And this is where the horse trading begins.
Although they're coming in from a much stronger position than I think even Netanyahu anticipated.
That's correct, even though the polls did show the rise of the religious Zionists over the last several weeks. But, we've seen some of the numbers on screen showing them getting 14 seats. One of the polls showing them only getting 12 seats. Yeah. One of the polls showing them getting 15 seats. So that's a big gap.
But yet we have seen the Likud go down in recent weeks from 35 down. So, a lot of those votes went to the religious Zionist party.
And I think it's going to be a lot easier for Netanyahu to justify to the international community forming a government together with the religious Zionists because of their strong electoral showing. Yep. If they had been a party that closed in at 10 seats, and maybe if Gantz had closed in at 10 or 11 and been a stronger party than them, I think there might have been more pressure on Netanyahu to form a government together with the centrist parties. But it'll be much easier for Netanyahu to turn around and say, hey, how can I ignore a party that received more than 10% of the vote in a government that has so many parties in it, and ignoring the third largest party and a party that's going to clearly recommend him to be the prime minister. When Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid go to Herzog, they're not going to recommend that Netanyahu be the prime minister. And I think it will be in religious Zionists' best interest to try to close a coalition agreement as soon as possible with Netanyahu, in order to make sure that they will be part of a strong right-wing
So I
alliance.
do want to get to Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid in just a moment, but I want to touch back on the religious Zionism. I mean, as we mentioned, they had a very strong showing at the polls. Smotrich is asking for the defense minister. Just a few weeks ago, he was asking as well for the justice ministry. He held a press conference with Simcha Rotman. They sort of outlined their view of the sort of the reform for the justice system. Other than the defense minister, other than the internal security minister, how many ministries can they take coming in with such a strong position?
Well, that really is up to the negotiations, and the amount of cabinet ministries that there are is not a fixed number.
Right.
Obviously, the smaller government can be, the executive branch, it becomes easier to rule. It becomes cheaper for the country. Cabinets have swelled in recent years because of the negotiation demands. Looking at these results, there are going to be many members of the Likud party that are going to be demanding high-ranking ministries in a Likud-led government. It probably won't be too difficult because you're really talking about a government of only 4 parties. And the Shas party and United Torah Judaism party are probably going to each demand 2 to 3 ministries at most. And in a cabinet that will probably be somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 to 30 or even 31 or 32 ministries, that's going to be a lot of ministries for members of the Likud party and for members of the Religious Zionist party. I think that what Netanyahu might try to do is to give religious Zionists more of the lower-ranking ministries than giving them some of the more high-profile ministries, probably wanting to keep the defense ministry and the foreign ministry, for example, inside the Likud. But this is really where the entire government circus begins, is once the recommendations and negotiations begin.
And what about Shas and United Torah Judaism? What ministries are they after?
So traditionally, Aryeh Deri's positioned himself to be the interior minister. You would see them want to control the religious ministries, the ministries over Jerusalem. United Torah Judaism traditionally has wanted the health ministry, the social welfare ministries, which are important for their constituents, and usually choosing to be less engaged in some of the more important defense and security and diplomatic ministries.
Now, I want to get back to Yair Lapid, Benny Gantz. I mean, Benny Gantz, how big of a disappointment is this evening for him, having, the religious Zionist party surpass him as the third largest party?
I think it's a big disappointment. In the second and the third election cycles, Gantz was positioned as the primary challenger to Netanyahu, in fact, in alliance with Yair Lapid. And together, those parties had soared as a single alliance to 32, 33 seats. Benny Gantz actually signed a rotation arrangement with Netanyahu, which would have, if that government lasted, made Gantz the prime minister in the second half of that government had it gone to term. And I think that this result demonstrates very clearly that the Israeli public does not view Benny Gantz as a viable candidate to be prime minister, as the leader of the 4th largest party, barely getting 10 seats.
Yeah. So, I mean, and right now we're seeing, based on the numbers, that really, I mean, any way that you sort of look at it, it really does seem like Netanyahu is poised to make his comeback. Yair Lapid, even with all of the parties, Meretz, Labor, Israel Beiteinu, they're only reaching between 54 to 55 seats. That still leaves them short, means that they will not be able to form a government without either joining the Arab parties once again, or maybe trying to see if they can, sort of bring in the ultra-Orthodox parties or someone from the right-wing bloc, which is extremely unlikely at this point.
Let's say, for example, that these results do shift 1 or 2 votes the other way, and then Netanyahu is at 60 or at 59 and doesn't have enough natural partners to form a majority. You need 61 in order to pass that first no-confidence vote in the Knesset. If you don't get it, that will just continue a cycle towards a 6th election unless somebody else can form a government. Even if the numbers shift a little bit and Netanyahu doesn't have the numbers, looking at these results, not only would Yair Lapid need to sit with Ram as they sat with the last time, they would also need to get the outside support or inside support from the other Arab alliance of Hadash and Ta'al, who are even more to the extreme than Ram, they refused to join in the last government. And there are members of the Lapid anti-Netanyahu camp that would refuse to sit with Hadash and Ta'al, outright. And that especially includes members of Benny Gantz's party, and particularly Gideon Sa'ar, Zev Elkin, and the other former Likud members who joined the
Well,
New
I
Hope.
mean, the question is, what would they prefer? To sit with the Arab parties in an effort to make sure that Netanyahu does not come back, or would they refuse and perhaps send the country into a sixth election?
Well, that would a sixth election is not an unlikely scenario if Netanyahu does fall short of the 61. But in that case, there will be frantic efforts. And I think that's what Adam was talking about earlier in the program about somebody else trying to emerge as a unifying candidate. Okay, I didn't get the most votes. That would be perhaps Benny Gantz, exactly, that he could say, hey, maybe I will sit with the Likud. Maybe I'll sit with the Likud in a rotation. Maybe I'll sit with the Likud. Maybe I'll sit with the Haredi parties and keep some of the religious Zionists out on the right-wing flank, keeping out Meretz on the left-wing flank, keeping out Avigdor Lieberman, who got a pretty small showing. It looks like he only got 4 or 5 seats, who's staunchly anti-religious. So he would be a total non-starter for sitting together with the religious parties and trying to form some kind of centrist unity alliance, perhaps in a rotation. And I think it should be clear that Israelis are not voting for rotation, even though that's what they've gotten the last few times. I don't think anybody really wants to see a rotation.
I think there's not much public trust left in the idea of a rotation. We've seen it the past, I think, 2 governments, and it just has not succeeded. Now, what if, there was a surprise and after the polls, after we counted all the votes, suddenly Ayelet Shaked would be back in the picture? That would really change things. Would she recommend Netanyahu? Would she recommend Lapid or Gantz?
Well, none of the polls showed Shaked getting anywhere near the threshold. Most of the polls showing her hovering around 2% of the vote. Some of the polls showing as high as maybe 2.5% of the vote. But you need 3.25% of the vote. So she was tens of thousands of votes short of the threshold in most of the polls, and it does appear that probably she did worse and not better than those polls. If she would get in, that would be very clear. That would increase the right-wing bloc by probably 2 seats and would make it even easier for Netanyahu to cross the threshold. But if you also look at the results and you look at Hadash Tal, were part of a joint list in the last government that had 6 seats. They, in all the polls, got 4 seats. Now, if votes get redistributed and then Hadash Tal somehow drops below the threshold, that would also redistribute votes, sending probably 2 more votes to the right wing and 2 votes to the left wing, and making it even easier for Netanyahu to form a government. So the real question will be if when the final votes are counted, because the exit polls are only a sampling and it's not a full count, if Likud, for example, loses 1 seat at the expense of Yesh Atid, so Likud goes down to 29 and Yesh Atid goes up to 23, and then maybe religious Zionists, right, and then maybe religious Zionists drop from 14 to 13, and Gantz goes up from.
But I think the big question is that if at the end of the day, we see that Netanyahu does not have 61 seats. Will he step aside and let, the Likud sit in a government with Yesh Atid, with national unity, sort of form a more central, more stable government? I mean, do you think he would do that? Do you think he would step aside?
Yeah, that's been the big argument in all these election cycles, right, which is if Netanyahu, and there's a great argument here that if Netanyahu would step aside, that you could form a very broad right-center alliance that might have as many as 65 or 70 seats if led by somebody else. However, Netanyahu is looking at these results. He sees that once again, he has brought in, as the head of the largest party in Israel, 30 seats, which is the largest by potentially 6, 7, or 8 votes, having the most electoral power of any other politician in the country. Why would he step down when over 1 million Israelis want him to be the prime minister much more than anybody else? And certainly he wants to be prime minister more than anybody
Absolutely.
else.
All right. Well, joining us now is Cassie Dillon, the U.S. Bureau News Editor for JNS. Thanks for joining us.
Cassie, it's nice to see you in Israel.
Yeah.
Usually you are parked on the other side of the ocean.
I know. It's nice being over here. It's an exciting time. Very exciting time for you to join us. And we've just gotten, the exit polls in.
Yes.
It's looking like Netanyahu will be the next prime minister of Israel. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what that means for the U.S.-Israel relationship with Biden in the White House now. How would the results of this election affect Israel's relations with the Biden administration?
I see this as twofold. So first, with the Biden administration, I think that Netanyahu doesn't have the warmest relationship with the Democratic Party. I think that's certainly true. It's going to be challenging, but we've seen in the past he's been very delicate with this. Obviously, his relationship with Obama was awful. But I think with Biden, it's a little bit of a fresh start there. It's not as contentious as it was with President Obama. But I do think this is really good news for the U.S.-Israel relationship. We know that Netanyahu has a very strong relationship, especially with the Protestants in America. So I think this is
Christians.
Exactly. So I think this is going to be very good for that relationship. But when it comes to Biden, I think Biden has a lot more worry that he's worried about right now with next week's elections. That I think he's just not going to navigate this one.
Do you think it gets harder for Netanyahu to have a strong relationship with the Democrats, particularly if he forms a narrow right-wing government with Itamar Ben-Gvir, and if Itamar Ben-Gvir becomes a high-ranking minister in that government?
That's an excellent question.
I think this will be more down the party line. I think this is going to be an issue with congressmen and the senators who've been calling out the Israeli government, getting involved in Israeli elections for their own parties. We've seen this happen in Congress throughout the past few weeks, really calling out this relationship.
And it was actually very interesting in my interview with Netanyahu just a week and a half ago. And in his memoirs, he actually writes about this, that Bill Clinton openly acknowledged trying to organize efforts to keep Netanyahu from office in the 90s. The Obama administration actually allocated State Department funds for the creation of V15, which was an NGO which was specifically trying to make Bougie Herzog, who is now the president, then was the leader of the Labor Party, try to defeat Netanyahu in the elections. In this election cycle, also, the Americans invested a lot of money into a get out and vote campaign, specifically in the Arab sectors, whereby if the Arabs would receive more votes, that would make it much more difficult for Netanyahu to form a right-wing government. Netanyahu has been challenged by the U.S. administrations that have never wanted him to sit in the prime minister's chair. They certainly prefer working together with Yair Lapid. They would be very happy to work with Benny Gantz as opposed to Netanyahu. But there's also the question, 2024 is only 2 years away, and if Netanyahu forms a government, he might be the prime minister beyond the life of a Biden administration. And we know that Netanyahu had a tremendously positive relationship with the Trump administration. So it really kind of depends on who is in power in the United States and who is in power in Israel.
Yeah, there's going to be a few different phases of this. So the short term, a week from now, right? Biden is very focused on these midterms. I don't think we're going to see anything from him come out in the next week. I think he's going to be very quiet on this. He's very, they're very worried in America right now that his party is going to lose. When it comes after that, I really do think that the midterms in America right now are going to be won by the Republicans in both chambers. And I think once that happens, I think a lot of Democrats are going to turn their backs on Biden because they really don't want him to be the nominee. And when that happens, Biden's going to have to go more left. And that is an opening for him to definitely be more anti-Netanyahu and to win over some of the more progressives.
So that's interesting. I mean, and Netanyahu did have an excellent relationship with Donald Trump, although towards the end it did mar. We've heard Trump make some comments against Netanyahu. I guess he was offended by him congratulating Biden so quickly. A lot of these Republicans are very pro-Trump supporters. I mean, how does that all factor in?
I mean, everything to Donald Trump is about loyalty. And to him, Netanyahu putting his state first instead of his relationship with him was disloyal. And so obviously he was going to have those comments. But as we've seen, Trump has made those types of comments at a lot of people, and he'll always forgive them or get back to them once they kiss the ring.
Trump had made those statements to Barak Ravid, who is a left-wing journalist in Israel who certainly wants to make both Trump and Netanyahu look bad. And Trump in the interview said that Netanyahu was one of the first world leaders to congratulate Joe Biden. It actually was not the case at all. Netanyahu was biding his time, waiting to see what the results would be. World leaders around the globe were congratulating Biden on winning the election. Netanyahu was waiting specifically because he had such a close relationship with Trump. And then all of a sudden, the headlines started pouring in CNN, BBC, elsewhere. How come Benjamin Netanyahu is not congratulating Joe Biden on the election? You know, trying to immediately create a wedge before Biden even got into the White House between him and Netanyahu. And Netanyahu had a choice. You know, what do I do? Do I stay loyal to Trump, who it appears has not won the election, or do I do what I need to do and congratulate Biden? And he actually put out a carefully worded statement saying congratulations to Joe Biden, but didn't mention that Joe Biden actually won the presidency. And yet Trump then turned around later and accused Netanyahu of being one of the first, when actually, in reality, he was one of the last.
Now, Netanyahu has also positioned himself, and he said this many times, that he is sort of the only Israeli politician today that is able to stand up to the pressures of the United States. I mean, looking back at Lapid's term and Bennett's term as prime ministers, were they able to stand up to the pressure of the United States administration on issues like Iran and the Palestinians? And do you think that that's true in the case of Netanyahu, that he really is going to be able to stand up to pressure from the United States?
Speaking certainly as an American, especially somebody that I am more right-wing, Netanyahu is a celebrity in the Republican Party. Everyone wants to take pictures with him, even after he was no longer prime minister. You saw Nikki Haley going and visiting him, and all of these senators, Lindsey Graham, Ted Cruz, all of them going to visit Netanyahu even when he was not prime minister. So he's a big celebrity. They're very happy about him being there. I do think that he can stand up to some of the pressures, especially coming from Joe Biden. We saw him do this with Barack Obama. So I think he's probably more equipped. I'm not really sure the other parties would have been as equipped. I think the UN General Assembly was, the speech there was very disappointing. I know you wrote a column about this, so you could speak more about that. But I think this is good news for at least the right wing in America and Netanyahu's relationship.
Well, Yair Lapid has been working lockstep with the Biden administration on foreign policy. And before Bennett and Lapid formed the government, Netanyahu was still the prime minister at the very beginning of the Obama administration. And we'll remember that Netanyahu actually led an incursion, not an incursion, but rather an attack on Gaza. And Antony Blinken came immediately to Israel to try to pressure Israel to stop after about a week. And one of the things that Antony Blinken demanded when he was here was that Netanyahu would permit the United States to reopen a consulate which dealt exclusively with the Palestinian Authority in the middle of downtown central Jerusalem on a Grove Street, right behind the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, that had traditionally been a consulate building for the Palestinian Authority, but had been shuttered by the Trump administration. The Biden administration wanted to reopen that. They demanded it of Netanyahu. It was a very tense meeting, and Netanyahu absolutely refused to reopen the consulate. And of course, Israel would need to give permission for that. The moment that the Bennett government was formed, Yair Lapid was the alternate prime minister and was also the foreign minister in that alignment. He told Antony Blinken that the United States could reopen that consulate. He didn't see that it was going to be such a problem. It wasn't until a reporting came out on that, some of that reporting led by JNS and others, pushing back on the reopening of the consulate, that Naftali Bennett and the Justice Minister, Gideon Sa'ar, actually from the right, stepped in and said, no, we're not going to permit the opening of the consulate. And that became a source of tension. So you do see there how the right wing and Netanyahu is more likely to stand up to pressure from the United States than Lapid or Gantz, but that has a reverberating effect in that it does cause tension with the Democratic Party in particular if Netanyahu stands up to that pressure. And one of the things that Lapid, as the foreign minister and now as the prime minister, has tried to do is say, no, we need to repair the relationship with the Democratic Party in order to make sure that Israel remains a bipartisan issue in the United States. And so he's been willing to give up certain things that the right wing would not give up on in order to make that relationship strong. The big challenge for Israelis is the question of whether or not Israel can be a bipartisan issue in a country like the United States that has very few bipartisan issues today, just
None.
because of the polarization of politics in the United States.
Almost no bipartisan issues. I think one thing important to note is if the Republicans take over Congress and the Senate, we're going to see the Iran deal just die in the water. They're going to have investigation after investigation, hearing after hearing. It's never going to happen.
And you saw a very different approach between Netanyahu and Lapid on the Iran deal. Netanyahu marched into the Congress with the Democratic president sitting in the White House, basically embarrassing the president of the United States, saying that that Obama's primary foreign policy prerogative to sign an Iran nuclear deal was a bad move.
Right.
That angered Obama to no end. Netanyahu also, famously lectured Obama in the Oval Office about forming a two-state solution based on the 1967 lines. But on the issue of Iran specifically, Lapid and Bennett and Gantz chose a different approach, which was to oppose it quietly, oppose it behind the scenes, not oppose it out in the public. And ultimately, it does look right now as though the Iran nuclear deal will not be signed. We were on the verge of getting signings during negotiations in Vienna.
Right.
But right now, the Iranian regime, the Islamic Republic, is very much on the brink of survival with mass protests inside the country. And we saw even Robert Malley, who's been the head negotiator, just say this week that it doesn't look like a nuclear deal will be signed. So it's very hard to argue at this point that Lapid and Bennett took the wrong approach, because it does look like the deal is not going to get signed. But had that deal gotten signed, then you would have been able to make a very strong competitive comparison.
And I want to also ask about the Abraham Accords. There hasn't been much progress made since the accords were signed under Bennett and under Lapid. I mean, we did see the Negev Forum. Now that Netanyahu is back, is this going to be something that he's going to be pushing for with the Biden administration? If Netanyahu will be back.
If he's going to be back. I'm not sure if that's going to be on the front lines of his policy, but it would be really good policy in the United States. I know Pakistan has had some delegates, not official government delegates, but have visited Israel. And so I think that it would be a smart policy for sure. But I also think that Biden just lost his foreign policy achievement, which would have been the Iranian deal. So I do think that he might try to get a little bit more involved in the Israeli-Palestinian issue to have a win, especially as the war in Ukraine has been going on for a long time. It's not an easy victory like what he thinks would be an easy victory with over here, but I do see him maybe changing his focus away from Iran and other issues in the Middle East.
Well, you had both members of the Netanyahu administration and the Trump administration saying that had the pair remained in office together, that several other countries, maybe as many as 5 other countries, would have signed on to the Abraham Accords. So there's no doubt the momentum has slowed. The Biden administration, and particularly U.S. Ambassador to Israel Tom Nides, I know is working night and day on trying to enhance the relationships that already exist. So they haven't gone against the nature of the accords, but at the same time, they're shifting the policy in such a way that has slowed down the momentum. And one of the biggest examples of that was a Negev summit that took place in February in Israel. The first time you had foreign ministers of the Emirates, of Bahrain, of Morocco come to Israel. And also you had the foreign minister of Egypt, who was one of the first countries to sign a deal with Israel in the 70s. And the other party to that summit was Antony Blinken. And what Antony Blinken managed to do, and what he said in his statement at the Negev summit, was that the Abraham Accords were no substitute for a track toward a two-state solution. And what's interesting about the Abraham Accords was that they were signed specifically because the Palestinian issue was placed on the side, where Netanyahu was saying to other moderate Arab countries in the region that we can have normalization even without a peace arrangement with the Palestinians. And what Blinken had done is tried to bring the Palestinian issue into the middle of the Abraham Accords. And when you saw that the Israeli government backed down, and allow the United States to come back as the major power broker and to bring the Palestinian issue back to the table, I think it made a lot of the Arab Muslim majority countries in the region suspicious of Israel watching its foreign policy turn, and that was part of the reason why some of that momentum will slow down. And Netanyahu certainly will work from day one to try to get the Abraham Accords momentum back on track. And as he told me in an interview, that he said that if he does form a new government, that in his term that he intends to make peace with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia being the major Muslim majority power in the region. And if he does that, he said that it's his goal to ultimately end the Arab-Israeli conflict. And so I think that will be his major foreign policy priority, aside from trying to prevent a nuclear Iran.
Well, I mean, that would be an incredible accomplishment. Cassie, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us this evening.
Thanks for having me. Good luck, guys.
And now we're going to bring back Adam Bellos to talk to us a little bit more about the exit polls. Adam, thanks for coming back.
No problem. I'm so happy after seeing the exit polls.
So, what are your thoughts?
I think this is Benjamin Netanyahu's world, and we all live in it. To be completely honest. I mean, fortunately, that was kind of where I saw things going, and it looks like that's what's going to happen. But there is some talk that the Arab parties might be able to cross the threshold up to 5 seats right now. So it might be a total of 10 or 8 seats to the Arab parties. And if that's the case, like I said earlier, that could upset Bibi's entire possibility of forming a government. But we don't know anything yet. And there's the possibility that there could be a margin of error. Earlier today, like we were saying, and I know you guys have mentioned it multiple times, this was one of the highest voter turnouts since 1999. And earlier today, they were saying there was an extremely low Arab voter turnout, which didn't really make much sense to me because since 2 elections before this crazy cycle, the Arab voter rate had been steadily rising. So I would actually assume that if I'm an Arab Israeli that has the ability to vote in Israel, which all Arab Israelis do, I would be taking this election very seriously because I would understand that the future of the country is actually going to be depending on the Arab vote. And that's a new situation for Israel to be in, which is very interesting, and that adds a great deal of nuance that's necessary to reading the political landscape and making a correct political assessment. So, I mean, like, if, just thinking about what I said earlier, you always get political pundits going on television just saying whatever comes to mind without taking the full account of the political field into what they're saying. And I think it's very important right now that that be taken into account. We have no idea what is going to happen with the amount of votes that the Arabs will receive. And if they receive 8 to 10 mandates, that's huge. I mean, that's more mandates, I believe, than any of the Arab parties have ever received in combined. I mean, that would be the largest Arab bloc, I think, in Israeli history, unless I'm wrong.
Well, Ram and the Joint List together had 10
last time
in the 4th government.
Right.
And in one of the previous governments that didn't last. I mean, one of the previous election cycles, they actually climbed all the way to 13 seats.
Right.
Oh, they did. They did. Okay.
And what that does, I think you're bringing a very important point, is what that does is that it shrinks the number of seats for Zionist parties, either on the right or the left. And what that means is that it becomes harder for example, Netanyahu to get to 61 because it's not 61 out of 120. It's 61 out of 120 minus however many Arab seats there are. So if the Arab seats go up to 10, as they were in the last election, or beyond, that's that many less seats that Netanyahu has to work with in order to form a right-wing government. And showing here in these polls that Netanyahu's bloc got 61 or 62 seats, that's not enough to definitively declare Netanyahu the victor, especially if the Arab parties or any of the other parties in the bloc might get 1 or 2 more seats after the actual counts take place.
I mean, it's all going to depend on what type of government Gantz will be okay with forming if Bibi is not given the opportunity to form the government first. It doesn't seem like it was a very popular thing that they formed a government with the Arab parties amongst the majority of the country. Now, I do believe that it was, I mean, listen, it was a huge thing, this last national unity government. It was a big deal. You had many parties saying they were doing what they were doing in favor of the country's future, and that that bringing in the Arab parties was a move forward in the evolution of Israel. And there's definitely water to that argument, especially if you read Alta Newland, by Theodore Herzl. And I understood where Lapid and Bennett were coming from when doing what they did and rationalizing things the way they did and wanting to have, a move forward into the future that's the post-Netanyahu era. The problem is that Israel is not actually done with the post-Netanyahu. I mean, there is not a post-Netanyahu era. We're still in the Netanyahu era. It restarted during the Arab Spring when he came back into office. And we're still dealing with agreements and peace agreements and the situation that he created for Israel. So, like I said earlier, we're going to have to wait to see what happens with the Arab vote. But I will say this. I don't think that Gantz is going to throw away the opportunity to have a steady four-year government as defense minister, okay, if he can form a government with Bibi. And I don't think Bibi is going to be so petty to not form a government with people just because they've messed around with him in the past. I mean, Bibi's the ultimate, when I was at the University of Arizona studying Israeli history, I had a teacher named Shlomo Aronson. His grandfather was the first chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, and he used to have this saying, Zionism is pragmatism, and you can't have Zionism without pragmatism. Bibi is the ultimate political pragmatist.
But it looks like over the last cycles that the other members of the government had not been pragmatic.
True.
Yeah, and they would not sit with Netanyahu, not the other way around.
I have a serious question for you. Do you think the majority of the public wants a sixth election?
I don't think the
Absolutely
government
not.
wanted
I don't think
a
anybody
second,
wants.
third,
Right.
fourth, or fifth election.
Yeah.
The reason why I say that is because of the voter turnout today. It's very clear that the Israeli people are done with this.
Maybe the opposite. Maybe if they're coming out to vote, they like voting, and they'll be happy to vote next time
it's a
as well.
testament to how much we love democracy here in Israel.
It's a day off, right?
There have been more elections in Israel than there have been in the rest of the Arab world in the last 100 years.
I do think Israelis are looking forward to a stable, four-year government. The question is how that government's going to look like. So, Adam, we are almost out of time, and I want to hear your final thoughts for the evening.
Here are my final thoughts. I do believe that Netanyahu will be able to form a government. I believe that he's probably going to bend over backwards to work with even the people that said that wouldn't work with him. It's always been a mistake. Especially, I just keep thinking of Shelley Yakimovich years ago. I will not sit with Netanyahu.
Former head of the Labor Party.
Former head of the Labor Party. And it ended up being the biggest mistake that she made because she could have taken Avodah to new heights if she would have gone into that government. Either way, there's two possibilities, like I said earlier. Either Benny Gantz or Netanyahu will end up being prime minister. And at the end of the day, those are two great Israeli men and who have sacrificed a lot for this country, who have the narrative to be national leaders. But if you're going to ask me who I'm going to put my money on, it's going to be Netanyahu.
All right, Adam, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight.
Thank you for having me, guys.
And you can never really count out Netanyahu. I mean, I think that's the lesson from multiple Israeli election cycles. And what I would say is, there's, even if we get towards a sixth election, which is an unthinkable scenario, but not necessarily more unthinkable than a fifth election or a fourth election or a third election in a row. People say, hey, what's going on with Israel's democracy? And Israel is actually a hyper democracy. And what I've told many people when they ask me about what's going on is that if the parliamentarians cannot solve the political crisis, the mandate returns where it should return, and that's to the people. And if that's the scenario in which the mandate keeps returning to the people to break the deadlock, that's actually healthy. And that's a lot better than the alternative, because if you look around this region, as Adam mentioned correctly, there's not too many elections that take place in the Middle East. So the fact that we're having them is actually healthy, and election day is a celebration of democracy. And I think that that's a reason why Israelis actually come out to vote, because they recognize just how precious it is to have that ability to decide who will be the leader of an independent Jewish state after so many years of persecution in the exiles. So 3,000 years of Jewish history, the right to be able to choose your leader at this time in history is a very, very special right that Israelis are clearly embracing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, do you agree with what Adam said, though, that, that Benny Gantz here could have a chance to lead another government? And, if so, will he sit with the Arab parties, and will any of the other parties be willing to sit in a government not only with Netanyahu, but with the national religious camp with Ben Gvir? Right.
So there's a few things to understand. First is that if Netanyahu does get 61 or 62, nobody can stop him from being the prime minister. I disagree with Adam in the sense that I think that if Netanyahu does get 61 or 62, I think it's highly likely that he will form a narrow right-wing government, because he'll view that as the most stable alliance that has the potential to last for a full term, right, which is certainly what he wants, and what the entire right-wing camp that will recommend Netanyahu as the prime minister want. So I think that that's the most likely scenario, but it depends on 61 or 62, and these exit poll results are too early to definitively declare Netanyahu the winner. Now, if Netanyahu does not get to 61, if he has 60, if he has 59, if he has 58, now the political circus is going to begin. And I do think that Benny Gantz is potentially positioned well to emerge as a candidate. Would Lapid sit with the Arabs? He absolutely would sit with the Arabs. Not only would he sit with Ram, I believe that he would potentially try to bring Hadash and Tal into that government as well. If that alignment of Lapid and Gantz and Labor and Meretz and those two parties got to 61, I think that he could consider trying to form a narrow left-wing Arab government at 61, if that's what he could do. And then the question is, could somebody like Benny Gantz emerge as a candidate who could find a way to break up the technical bloc of the religious Zionists? I mentioned that bloc is actually three smaller parties, one led by Bezalel Smotrich, one led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, and a smaller Noam party, which is potentially even further to the extreme. Mm-hmm. And maybe to get that block to break, bring Smotrich in, maybe leave Ben-Gvir out, leave Meretz on the far left out, leave Ram and the Arab parties out, but try to form a government that might include Labor, would include Yesh Atid and the National Unity led by Gantz, include also the Orthodox parties, the Shas and the United Torah Judaism, mm-hmm, and potentially to try to lure some members of the Likud away and offer them high-ranking ministries in order to do so. So there's many, many scenarios if Netanyahu doesn't get to 61, and of course the scenario that nobody wants to hear is that we might find ourselves in 6 months' time in an election. So what will happen is, on the next 48 hours, the president, with the final counts, will open up invitation to all the parties to come in. Mm-hmm. Heads of the parties will recommend who they want to be the prime minister. The president will then select the candidate that they think is the best positioned. And right now, even if he doesn't reach the 61, it is looking like it will be Netanyahu. Yeah, but that's where Herzog, the president, might have a little bit of leeway. Now, just because the Arabs, let's say the Hadash Tal party, who have always refused to join an Israeli government, they may actually recommend Lapid as the prime minister, even if they wouldn't intend to sit with him. Mm-hmm. So you might see Netanyahu get 60 recommendations and Lapid gets 60 recommendations. And even though Netanyahu might be better positioned to form a government, you might see Herzog in that scenario turn around and say, well, actually, Lapid is the current prime minister, and I'm going to give him the first opportunity. If Netanyahu is 61, Herzog will give Netanyahu the first chance to form a government. And Netanyahu does want that first chance. Of course he wants the first chance, but it's not about who gets the chance first. It's about who has the numbers. So What will happen is, let's say Netanyahu does get the first chance. He will then have 2 weeks to form a government. If he cannot form a government within 2 weeks, he can go to the president and get potentially a 2-week extension. The president has to accept that. In order for him to get that extension, he would have to show that the parties are serious about negotiating and it's only a matter of closing the portfolios. He could get an additional 2 weeks, which would give 28 days. If after 28 days Netanyahu still could not form a government, or whoever was the first candidate, then the president can turn to the person that he thinks is the second most suitable to form a government. And in that scenario, it would probably be Lapid, but it could be Benny Gantz. Then that candidate would have 14 days to try to form a government. If at the end of that 14-day period, that candidate was unable to form a government, then there would be a new period which would open up for another 2 weeks in which any member of the parliament could come with a petition. And that could include somebody that wasn't previously selected. That could include Netanyahu again. That could include Lapid or Gantz again. And if any member of the parliament comes with a petition of 61 members that would agree to join their government, then that candidate would get 2 weeks to try to form a government. And if by that time nobody was able to put together a government, that would be an automatic trigger for another election.
So, I mean, we do have some time. It's important for our viewers to know that even though the exit polls have come in, even though we are going to get the results of the final polls in the next couple of days, we still won't know who will be the prime minister for at least another 2 weeks, if not longer. Alex, final thoughts for tonight.
Well, first of all, is obviously an Israeli government can only be formed by a union of parties that are potentially ideologically aligned, maybe not potentially ideologically aligned on certain issues. What we've managed to do tonight was to put together a technical block of media outlets, JNS, ILTV, Israel 365, all coming together to try to provide informative analysis on the eve of the elections and reach as many people as possible. So I think that we have succeeded in the spirit of forming a coalition. I'm very proud. And again, I think that elections is a celebration of Israeli democracy. I also think that even the political dysfunction is not a reflection of a greater dysfunction in Israeli society. I think that the Israeli people are actually much more united than a lot of the politicians at the top of the spectrum. I think that there are some very narrow political interests that prevent the parliamentarians from doing the right thing and sitting together. But the Israeli society is very, very vibrant. The foundations of the society are strong. This is a country that is on the ups economically, socially, family values strong. Israelis are happy to live here. And so I think that the future of Israel is very, very bright. And the fact that we keep having elections is just another day off and something to celebrate.
Absolutely. And the fact that we had such high voter turnout, I think, speaks to that. Looking at the exit polls tonight, it does look like Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to be the next Prime Minister of Israel, but too soon to tell. And we, of course, are going to keep following and provide updates at JNS, at ILTV, at Israel 365, I'm sure. So, Alex, thank you so much for your insights tonight. And thank you to all our guests and to all our viewers who've been watching us all night and hearing the updates on the Israeli elections. Stay tuned to ILTV, to JNS for more updates in the coming days and weeks. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.